Dear friends, sociology is often defined as study of social relations or human institutions like family, kinship, patterns of social change, structures of authority, and how societies are divided across classes, communities, how world is structured today, and how human relations are in a sense governed by a certain set of norms and values. Our everyday life is also social life, and we generally don't talk about everyday life in the discipline of sociology. Today we have with us somebody who has been for the last 40 odd years intervening in contemporary Indian intellectual kind of processes. We have with us Professor Andre Bete, who has been a professor of sociology at Delhi University and currently is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Sociology in Delhi University, and has also been chairman of Indian Council of Social Science Research. So we will ask him about how sociologists have dealt with everyday life and how sociology in a sense has become part of everyday life in contemporary India. How do concepts in sociology have become part of our everyday understanding of ourselves. Let me begin with something very general, Professor Bete. As sociologists or social scientists, it is kind of easier to talk about larger structures or social institutions, or what one would call as grand processes of social change, development of capitalism, industrialization. But when we come to everyday life, getting up in the morning or going to work, and the kind of experiences we have which in a sense influence our moods, they are also social experiences. Sociologists have given much lesser kind of attention to these everyday realities of social life.
That is in one sense true, but one has to be careful about how much one can expect from the sociologist. In a sense, everybody lives in a society, but everybody is not a sociologist. A sociologist has a particular approach to the understanding of social reality, which he cultivates, which he develops over a long period of study, investigation, inquiry and analysis. So I think that one must make a distinction between the sociological approach to whatever it is in human societies and the common sense approach. I have myself made a distinction between sociology and common sense. One must never forget the fact that sociology is an intellectual discipline, and it is also a profession. So while we do address matters of everyday experience, we cannot solve all the problems that come up in everyday life. I mean, after all, when a sociologist goes to study a village, for instance, by living in that village, what does he do? He of course observes and records the everyday experience, but he does not report on what he observes and records in the same way in which a journalist does. He tries to relate it to the insights which he has acquired from his discipline. So everyday life and everyday experience is the basic material out of which sociologists construct their analyses, their interpretations and their theories. But the raw data of everyday life is not the same as sociology. Everybody experiences everyday life, but everybody does not approach his experiences of everyday life in the way in which a sociologist does.
What do you think is the difference between a psychologist's approach to everyday life, who would focus on human personality in a sense, and a sociologist's approach to everyday life, who do talk about cultures and values and ideologies which in a sense shape our responses to everyday situations?
Well, you know, I am not a psychologist, so I wouldn't be able to say very much about what the psychologist does, but let me point out what I believe to be the distinctive features of the sociological approach, and I will try rather to distinguish the sociological approach from the approach of the informed citizen. I think that there are three very important features that are associated with the sociological approach. Sociology is an empirical science. Sociologists look at facts, in a way which is somewhat different from the way in which facts are examined or experienced by the ordinary person. So sociology is an empirical science, and that must be kept in mind. And if sociology is different from common sense, it is partly because the sociologist looks at these facts, observes these facts, records these facts in a disciplined way which is different from the way in which the ordinary citizen observes and experiences these facts. So it is very important to stress the point that sociology is an empirical science. Sociology is also a systematic science, in the sense that the observations that the sociologist makes on a village or on a household or on a community, he has to put together the different observations in a systematic way so that those who read about that village or that community or that factory get a coherent picture of it. The man of common sense is not always able to produce the kind of coherent picture which the sociologist, through his training in a particular intellectual discipline, is able to provide. Then there is a third aspect of sociology which I think is very, very important. It is the fact that sociology is a comparative science, that sociologists do not begin and end with one particular community or even one particular country, but that they look at the nature of family, kinship, marriage, religious beliefs and practices in a variety of different societies. And I think that is one of the problems with sociology in India today, with the way in which the discipline and the profession have grown in our country today. I think we tend to confine our attention exclusively to the Indian reality. This is not a very healthy thing. Of course, India should always be at the center of our attention, but we should also look at what is happening in other societies and try to find out in a systematic way the similarities and differences between ourselves and others. I would say this is the heart of sociology, to look at the similarities and differences between ourselves and others. And let me add, I've often said this, that when the French were studying only French society, they were not yet sociologists. When the Germans were studying only German society, they were not yet sociologists. It is only when they began to study their own society as well as other societies and to make comparisons and contrasts that the discipline of sociology emerged as a distinctive intellectual discipline.
Long ago, C. Wright Mills had said that sociology is a science that helps us understand the relationship between biography and history. In a sense, individual and social structure, the same thing can be said in a different language. This was in a sense very useful kind of way of looking at both sociology as well as individual personality and his or her kind of worldview. What do you think, do we have any concepts in sociology which help us in becoming reflexive about our everyday life, the actions we do, the kind of relations we have? Does sociology have a role to play in making our life, everyday life, better?
It certainly has a role to play in giving us a more informed understanding of everyday life. Whether that makes us better citizens or not, I'm not really able to say. But it certainly gives us a more informed understanding of the environment in which we live. Now, it's true that Wright Mills said that sociology stands at the intersection of individual biography and history. And that is a very noble statement of the goals of sociology. But if you look at the works of C. Wright Mills himself, his most outstanding contributions were to the understanding of the larger structures of society. He wrote a book called White Collar. Yeah. That is an outstanding book on the nature and the changing role of the middle class in American society. And I think that although that book was written nearly 60 years ago, we have a great deal to learn from that book about what is happening in our society. Then he wrote another book called The Power Elite, which was devoted to an analysis of the structure of power and the interlocking of various structures of power in the United States. Now you will ask, how does all this help us to understand individual lives? I think it does help us to understand individual lives, because we get to know by trying to examine systematically the nature of the middle class, we get to know better the divisions within that middle class, between the lower middle class and the upper middle class, the way in which people strive to move from one layer of the middle class to the other layer of the middle class. This is happening before our eyes every day. And if we have a clear understanding of the framework within which this is happening, then we understand our everyday lives much better. So sociology tries to provide an understanding of the framework within which everyday life is lived, and it is extremely important to have a clear understanding of that framework in order to make sense of what is happening around us.
So Bitil, the world has changed over the last 3 or 4 decades in a manner in which it wasn't changing earlier. I'm referring to the process of globalization. Globalization is not simply about technology and computers, but there's also large scale migration taking place all over the world. Most of the world societies are now plural societies, and coming back to the point that you were making, that sociology helps us understand comparative situations. I mean, do you think that the role of sociological understanding of culture in a sense becomes handy when we have to talk about things like ethnic differences in city of New York? There was a time when nation states were in a sense seen as homogeneous ethnic entities, never in India but in the Western world definitely so. So do you think that this kind of growing fluidity and complexity of the world increases the value of sociology in everyday life?
Certainly, most certainly. But it also provides new challenges. It provides challenges as well as opportunities. It makes the subject that we study enormously more complex and challenges us to develop methods and concepts that will be able to cope with these new challenges that are coming up. Talking about the complexity of urban life, I'll give you 2 examples. There were 2 outstanding American sociologists who made a study of New York City, Nat Glazer and Daniel Moynihan, and wrote a book which was called Beyond the Melting Pot. Now that's a very outstanding work, and I think it has relevance to our lives even today. Then I will refer to another paper which was written by an Indian sociologist whom I happen to know very well, Professor Nirmal Kumar Bose. This was published as a paper in Scientific American, and it was called Calcutta, a Premature Metropolis. I don't think that Professor Bose really depended very much on the writings of Glazer and Moynihan. He had observed the city of Calcutta, and he was trying to show how this city of Calcutta grew and how it was changing through the interface between the different communities that inhabited that city. Now this problem has become more challenging because there is greater flow of persons across national boundaries. But in India there has always been flow of persons across regional boundaries, and that is not unimportant. When people move from an area where one language is spoken and where they had grown up to speak that language into another state or region where a different language is spoken, it is a major change. This has been happening in India for quite some time, indeed for decades and centuries. So these do provide challenges. But I think one point I would like to stress, and that is this, that sociology as a discipline, sociology as a profession, performs a very, very useful service to society. But you must not expect sociologists to solve every problem. I would like to make a distinction between the approach of the sociologist and the approach of the journalist. I'm a sociologist, I'm not a journalist. I am not trained to provide instant answers to immediate questions. An intellectual discipline takes time. It grows, understanding through that discipline grows over a period of time. So one must not be too quick to provide answers to problems that are developing before one's eyes. For instance, there are lots of people who have written about the Indian village. I spent 1 full year living in one single village. I don't want to run down what is written on our rural society by the journalists. But their way of writing, their way of observing, their way of analyzing is quite different from the way in which the sociologist does it. I think that one must keep this in mind, that sociology is an intellectual discipline. Do not expect instant answers to questions of immediate importance from sociologists.
Let me put it in a little more kind of sharper language. Do you think the whole idea of everyday life makes sociologically any sense? I mean, do we need to take everyday life seriously, because everyday life is also in a sense reproduction of life through, in a sense, our understanding of social structure and the dynamics of world. Do we need to critically examine the very idea of everyday life?
Yes, I think we do. I think we do, but it depends on what kind of approach we adopt to everyday life. We make empirical analyses of neighborhoods, of communities, of factories. I mean, what do we do there? We examine everyday life there. Should we then have a separate sub-discipline devoted to the study of everyday life? About that I am a little skeptical. I think everyday life enters into every kind of sociological analysis. So to try to make the distinction between the sociology of everyday life and the sociology of some other kind of life may be a little frustrating. But I think that we do make a distinction between the sociology of kinship and the sociology of religion, or between political sociology and economic sociology. I am not very sure that the sociology of everyday life is the kind of sub-discipline that the sociology of religion or the sociology of kinship or economic sociology is.
Do you think it also poses challenges to the discipline of sociology, in the sense when we are confronting everyday life, we cannot look for facts in a sense. The fluidity of everyday life in a sense is much more obvious, and it becomes difficult to deal with everyday life with the kind of conceptual categories that sociology has. So do we need to have new kind of conceptual categories if we have to understand things like working of democracy in everyday life or violence in everyday life?
Well, the first thing that has to be kept in mind is that one has to be patient. Of course we need to observe everyday life. Of course we need to take everyday life seriously. Of course we recognize that everyday life has a very fluid character. But if we have the patience to observe everyday life in a particular social setting over a period of time, then we see that underlying this fluidity, underlying this flux, there are patterns, and it's the job of the sociologist to identify these patterns. You know, there's a very famous study of social stratification and social mobility in a number of Western countries. It's a work by a Swedish sociologist called Robert Eriksson and a British sociologist called John Goldthorpe. And the title of that book is The Constant Flux, that people are all the time moving up and down in the social scale. But nevertheless, the social hierarchy retains a certain kind of structure despite the continuous movement of people across this social system. I'm not saying that the structure itself does not change, but the fact that everyday life appears to be changing all the time does not mean that the structure of everyday life is also changing.
Do you think the fluidity of human societies and therefore the significance of everyday life has grown in the last 20 years with the kind of new technologies we have, particularly media? I mean, media not only television and radios or newspapers, but also the whole notion of time has changed with internet becoming available, and also the labor markets or job markets have changed with work being outsourced. The notion of space has changed. So do you think that the significance of everyday life has considerably increased in our notion or understanding of the world?
Well, let me put it like this. Everyday life today is in many ways different from what everyday life was 100 years ago. But there was everyday life even 100 years ago. It's not as if everyday life came into existence only with the internet. The everyday life was always there. But our approach to the understanding of everyday life has perhaps changed somewhat, and it needs to change. And it is true that societies are in greater flux now than they were 100 years ago. Things have become more fluid. People are moving around much more. This is certainly true, but we must be careful not to exaggerate the rigidity of past times. There was a certain amount of flux, even 100 years ago, even 200 years ago. And there was flux in society, even 200 years ago. Although the scale of movements has perhaps become much more rapid in the last 50 or 60 years. That's certainly true.
What implication would these processes of migration and globalization have for our understanding of the very notion of society? For a long time, sociologists have worked with, in a sense, culturally bound societies like French society or German society or Indian society. We know Indian society today cannot be talked about without including Indian diasporas, and they are all over the world, and their understanding of India in a sense influences Indians' understanding of India, and in a sense American elections cannot be held unless they are sensitive to Indian sensibilities. So the very idea of society and comparative science of society, do you think that also is undergoing change?
Yes, but as I said, everything undergoes change and has been undergoing change for the last 100 years. But you know, I think that it is a mistake to think that we should try to understand everything all at once. I think that is the difference between the sociologist and the journalist. I mean, if you are trying to understand everything that is happening under your eyes all at once, then you will not reach any significant sociological understanding. You may be able to produce a nice report for the newspaper, which is read and then forgotten the next day, or a nice report for a television channel, which is seen and heard and then forgotten the next hour. Our way of producing knowledge is quite different from the way in which knowledge is produced in the media and the way in which it is used in the media. I don't want to belittle the contribution that the media and advances in technology have made to our understanding of the world as a whole. But I don't think that this rapid flux that is taking place, and that the media tend to exaggerate a little. I'm saying that it is taking place, but one must not exaggerate that. I don't think that that should prevent us from going on with our business, which is the hard and patient task of observing reality over a long period of time, taking time to analyze it, taking time to present our findings for a whole profession, which will then develop it further across the generations. It's a very different kind of understanding. It's a different kind of intellectual task from what is done in ordinary life. As I said, you know, even the housewife, every housewife has to balance the budget, but every housewife is not an economist. Every individual member of society participates in family life, but he's not necessarily a sociologist of the family. And I think that if sociologists are impatient to try to find solutions to what is happening under their eyes here and now immediately, I think that they will be giving up something that has been of great intellectual value, which is the slow, steady, cumulative accumulation of human knowledge.
The last question, many concepts that have been developed by sociologists have become part of everyday life, not only caste and class, but also concepts like dominant caste or vote bank and many other similarly categories in the Western societies. Do you think that these concepts undergo a complete change when they are used by media and people in everyday life?
They do undergo a change, they do undergo distortion, but that is not necessarily an argument against their being adopted by the media. For instance, vote bank. I saw the concept being developed by M.N. Srinivas before my very eyes, because we worked together in the Delhi School of Economics in the Department of Sociology, and M.N. Srinivas developed that concept, and now it has become common currency. It has now become common currency, and that's a very, I think a great sociologist is simply a sociologist who can change the common sense of the world in which he lives, and that is given to only a very few people.
Thank you very much, Professor Bethe. As we have discussed, everyday life is definitely important, but sociology doesn't need to be engaged only with everyday life. Everyday life is part of social life, and social life is, in a sense, historically structured. It is given to us. It has larger global comparative dimensions, and a good sociology should be able to take into account all these things. Thank you very much, Professor Bethe, again. Thank you.